Okay, so are you ready to dive into this case?
Definitely. Yeah, this one's pretty intense.
Yeah, you send over excerpts from Gary Ridgway's Wikipedia page, The Green River Killer, and wow,
A lot to unpack there.
it is. So where do we even begin? I guess maybe we should start with like his early life.
Yeah, so Ridgway was born back in 1949, and his childhood, like many individuals who end up committing these kinds of crimes, had a lot of, um, issues and challenges.
Yeah, I was reading about his relationship with his parents. It sounds like that was really difficult, especially with his mother.
Yeah, definitely a very domineering mother and strained relationships with both of his parents. That's something that we see a lot in the background of these types of individuals.
Oh, and then bedwetting into his teenage years. That's
Yeah, that's another thing that we see that comes up sometimes.
But I mean, there's something else too that really kind of stood out to me. When he was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy.
That's right. And I mean, the boy survived, but that incident right there at such a young age.
Yeah, it's pretty chilling to think about, what could have happened.
Yeah, it's a huge red flag. It's like a premonition almost
Right.
of this darkness that was to come.
And then like you look at his adult life and it doesn't get much better, does it?
No, not really. I mean, multiple failed marriages. His ex-wives describe some pretty disturbing things about his sexual demands.
It's like you can almost see those pieces starting to fall into place.
Yeah.
You see these early signs of trouble and then,
Yeah, but it's important to remember that you can't just draw a straight line from those early experiences to his crimes, right?
right.
There's so many other factors at play,
Yeah.
and it's really complex.
So how do we make sense of that then? Like, how do we understand how someone becomes a serial killer?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a
Hmm.
question that experts have been grappling with for decades, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But we can try to delve deeper into those complexities. Like, I think one interesting area to explore is his time in Vietnam. Did that
Hmm.
contribute to his psychological state? Was there some undiagnosed trauma? We need to consider all these angles.
Okay, so then let's talk about the crimes themselves. For over 2 decades, he terrorized the Seattle and Tacoma area, preying on these vulnerable women, mostly sex workers and runaways.
Yeah, and that choice of victim is incredibly significant. I mean, these were women who lived on the margins of society. Their disappearances often went unnoticed or unreported for long periods.
And that just gave him more opportunity to continue.
Exactly. It's a chilling reminder of how societal biases can really intersect with these types of horrific acts.
Absolutely. And the way he carried out these crimes, it's just terrifying. I mean, he would strangle his victims often during or after sex, and then he would meticulously dispose of their bodies in these wooded areas around the Green River,
Hence the name.
hence the name, the Green River Killer. But it's like he was almost trying to make them vanish without a trace.
Right, there's that meticulousness that we see a lot with serial killers, this
Hmm.
need for control, this desire to maintain power, even in this horrific act of taking a life. And with Ridgway, he took it even further, right? He admitted to necrophilia. That adds this whole other disturbing layer to his psychological profile.
And to think that he was doing all of this while maintaining a seemingly normal life,
Hmm.
right? He had a job, he had a home, he was even in relationships. How do you compartmentalize something like that? It's truly mind-boggling.
That's the thing about serial killers, right? They often lead these double lives. They blend in, seamlessly appearing totally normal while harboring this incredible darkness within.
And that's what makes them so difficult to catch, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't fit the stereotype of, the monster under the bed.
Right, exactly. They can be anyone, and that's what makes this case so fascinating, but also incredibly disturbing.
So let's get into the investigation a little bit, because I know this is one of those cases where they actually had him on their radar pretty early on. They even took a saliva sample from him as far back as 1987.
That's right. And that detail right there really highlights the limitations of forensic science at the time. I mean, DNA testing was in its infancy. If this had happened today,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
he would have been caught way sooner.
And it gets worse, because they had this evidence, this spray paint evidence that they found on one of the victims' clothing, and they didn't test it for 20 years.
Ugh, it's so frustrating.
And guess what? It turned out to be a match for the brand of spray paint used at the Kenworth truck factory, where Ridgway worked as a painter.
Oh, it makes you wonder how many other cases are out there with evidence just sitting on a shelf waiting to be re-examined with modern technology.
Right.
It's kind of a crazy thought.
It's like we're constantly playing catch up.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole other element to the investigation that I still find hard to wrap my head around. They actually brought in Ted Bundy to help.
It's pretty wild, right? You have one notorious serial killer offering insights into the mind of another.
It almost feels like you're making a deal with the devil.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
pretty controversial move for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But you know what? Some of Bundy's insights were actually spot on.
Really?
Yeah, it highlights this strange truth that sometimes understanding the mind of one killer can actually help catch another.
It's scary, but also kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue.
So ultimately, though, it was the advances in DNA technology that finally led to his arrest, right? That 1987 saliva sample finally matched DNA from the crime scenes in 2001,
Science caught up with him
and that's what brought an end to his reign of terror.
after nearly 2 decades.
But then things get even more complicated because after his arrest, he enters into this plea bargain. He agrees to confess to 48 murders and provide information that leads to the discovery of more victims' remains.
Yeah, that plea bargain was hugely controversial. Some people were outraged. They felt like the death penalty was the only option.
Right.
But others felt like getting those answers for the families was more important.
It's a tough call, isn't it?
Really tough. And then to make matters even more complex, he comes out and says that he's killed so many women he's lost count.
Oh my gosh, that's chilling to think about.
It really is. I mean, his final confession was for at least 71 murders. That makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history.
It makes you wonder what goes on in someone's mind to be capable of such cruelty.
Yeah, it's one of those fundamental questions that we may never have a complete answer to.
Right.
But I think it's so important that we remember the human cost of all of this. We're not just talking about numbers here. We're talking about individual lives tragically cut short.
Yeah, like Wendy Caulfield,
Yeah.
Debra Lynn Bonner, Cynthia Jane Hines. These were real people with families and friends and dreams, and their lives were stolen.
And tragically, some of his victims remain unidentified even to this day.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
It really is.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've explored Ridgway's early life. We've delved into the details of his crimes, and we've examined the complex investigation that finally brought him to justice.
But there's still so much more to unpack.
There is. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore the aftermath of his arrest, the impact on the families of the victims, and the lasting legacy of the Green River Killer case.
It's going to be a heavy conversation, but I think it's an important one to have. So join us for the next part as we continue to delve into this truly disturbing and fascinating case.
We'll see you there.
It's important to remember, I think, that we can try to understand these individuals like Ridgway, but there are limits to what we can really, truly comprehend about their psyche.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's this part of us that just wants to try to understand, how someone could do something like this.
Right. So those confessions, while unsettling, do offer a glimpse into his thinking. And one thing that really stands out is his approach to his crimes. It was just so chillingly pragmatic.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, he talked about choosing prostitutes because they were easy to pick up, and even went as far as to say that he hated most of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's language completely devoid of empathy. It reflects this total dehumanization of his victims.
It's like he was trying to remove any sense of guilt or remorse, almost like he was justifying it to himself.
Exactly. And that lack of remorse, that inability to understand or share the feelings of others, is a hallmark of what experts call psychopathy.
Psychopathy.
Yeah, it's a severe personality disorder, and it's often linked to serial killers.
And then there's the necrophilia, like the fact that he admitted to having sex with some of his victims after he already killed them.
Right, that just adds another layer of darkness to this whole thing.
It really does.
He even claimed that he started burying his later victims to try to resist that urge. But I think we have to be careful about taking everything he said at face value,
Yeah.
He was still trying to avoid the death penalty at this point.
Right.
So there's a good chance he was manipulating the narrative, trying to present himself in a more favorable light.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, these confessions are valuable, but we always have to keep in mind the context.
Exactly. But regardless of his motivations, those confessions did help investigators locate the remains of some victims who had been missing for years.
And that brought at least some measure of closure to those families.
Absolutely. But I think it's also important to remember that true justice goes beyond just confessing and being punished. It's about acknowledging the impact of these crimes, honoring the memory of the victims and working to prevent these horrors from happening again.
Yeah, for sure. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the investigation itself. I mean, it spanned over 2 decades, involved hundreds of investigators. It was one of the most complex and high-profile cases in American history.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges they faced early on was the limitations of forensic science at the time. Like we
Mm.
talked about, DNA testing was just in its infancy.
Right, so they had to rely on more traditional methods.
Exactly. Things like witness statements, physical evidence, behavioral analysis. It was a much slower process.
And then, of course, there's that spray paint evidence we talked about earlier.
Ugh, don't even get me started on that. It's just mind-boggling to think that if they had acted on that sooner, they might have been able to connect Ridgway to the crimes much earlier.
I know, it's so frustrating.
It really highlights the importance of constantly reevaluating evidence as technology advances.
Right.
I mean, look at how many cold cases are being solved today thanks to breakthroughs in DNA analysis.
It's pretty amazing.
It is like a race against time with science constantly evolving.
Yeah, but on top of the forensic challenges, they also had this massive amount of information to sift through. The Green River Task Force collected mountains of evidence, thousands of tips, interviews, reports. I can't even imagine trying to make sense of all of that.
Yeah, it's what we call information overload, and it's a huge problem in these types of complex investigations. You have to be able to filter through all that data, identify those crucial bits of information, and then somehow connect the dots.
Sounds like searching for a needle in a haystack.
It is, and then you add the psychological element to it, trying to get inside the mind of a serial killer.
Right, like how do you understand their motivations, predict their next move?
That's where criminal profiling comes in.
Ah, yes.
Oh, yeah.
The whole trying to create a psychological sketch of the offender thing.
Exactly, and it's a controversial field for sure, but it can be a valuable tool.
And in this case, they even consulted with Ted Bundy.
Yeah, that's right. It was a really controversial move, but some of Bundy's insights were actually pretty accurate.
It's so strange to think about.
It is. It really makes you think about the nature of evil, the possibility of rehabilitation, whether a killer can truly offer remorse, or if they're just manipulating the system.
So many layers.
So many.
But ultimately, the Green River Task Force never gave up. They kept at it for years, and in the end, their persistence paid off.
Yeah, their dedication was truly remarkable. They were determined to solve this case and bring some justice to the families of the victims.
And they did.
They did.
And that, I think, is a really important point to remember.
Absolutely. I mean, this case is about so much more than just a successful investigation. It's a stark reminder of the devastating impact that serial killers have on individuals' families, entire communities.
It's a story of loss, grief, and the long, arduous journey towards healing and justice.
Right. And that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to look at the ripples of this case, the continuing efforts to identify all of Ridgway's victims, and the broader lessons that society has learned from this dark chapter in American history.
It's going to be a heavy conversation, but a necessary one.
I agree. Okay, so we spent a lot of time with this really disturbing story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. I mean, we've explored his crimes, we've tried to get into his head, and we've looked at the investigation that ultimately brought him to justice.
Yeah, and it's been pretty heavy stuff.
It really has.
Yeah.
But I think as we wrap up our deep dive, it's really important to kind of shift our focus to the aftermath. You know, the lasting impact of his actions and what we can learn from all of this.
Absolutely. I mean, the ripples of a case like this, they just extend so far beyond just the victims themselves. You have the families, the communities, even the investigators who dedicated years of their lives to this.
Right, so let's start with the families. I mean, I can't even imagine the pain and the anguish of not knowing what happened to your loved one for years, sometimes even decades, fearing the worst, and then having that fear confirmed in such a horrific way.
It's unimaginable, really. And even after the arrest, the conviction, the sentencing, the pain doesn't just go away. They have to find a way to live with that knowledge, with this immense hole in their lives.
Yeah.
And sometimes they never even find their loved one's remains.
That's got to be incredibly difficult.
It is, and then there's the added pain of knowing that their loved one was targeted because of their vulnerability, right? Because they were marginalized by society.
Right, many of his victims were sex workers, runaways, women who were already living on the fringes.
Exactly, and their disappearances were often overlooked, sometimes even dismissed. It's a tragic reminder that we as a society need to do better. We need to protect those who are most vulnerable.
For sure. Now let's talk about the investigators, because these individuals dedicated years of their lives to catching the Green River Killer. I mean, they poured everything into this case. What kind of impact did that have on them?
Well, I can only imagine the emotional burden of confronting that level of depravity day after day. staring into that abyss of human cruelty.
Right, and on top of that, you have the pressure to solve the case, to bring closure to the families, to stop the killings. And every day that he was out there, they knew he could be claiming another victim.
It's a heavy weight to carry.
It is. And even after they caught him, I imagine there's still that lingering question of, could we have caught him sooner? Could some of those victims still be alive if things had gone differently?
Absolutely. Those what-ifs can really eat away at you.
So I think it's really important that we acknowledge the sacrifices that these investigators made, the toll that this case took on their personal lives, their families, their mental and emotional well-being.
I agree. These are the unsung heroes in these stories, the ones who worked tirelessly in the face of true darkness. And their efforts brought a sense of justice, a sense of closure.
Okay, so let's talk about justice for a minute. I mean, Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus another life sentence for a 49th confirmed victim.
Yeah,
He's going to die in prison. Do you think that's a fitting punishment for his crimes?
that's a tough question. Some people feel that the death penalty was the only appropriate option, an eye for an eye, but others believe that life in prison with the weight of his actions hanging over him is a fate worse than death.
It's a debate that probably won't ever be settled. But I think it's important to remember that the decision to accept a plea bargain was made with the families in mind. That desire to bring closure, to recover the remains of their loved ones, that was a huge factor.
Right, and that brings us to another important point, the ongoing effort to identify all of his victims. Even today, decades later, there are still women who remain missing their families, still searching for answers.
And thanks to advances in DNA technology, investigators are still working to connect remains to those missing women. It's a long and difficult process, but it's a sign that they haven't given up hope.
It's a testament to the dedication of law enforcement and forensic scientists. They're not letting these cases fade away.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Green River Killer case, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of vigilance and awareness. Serial killers often prey on those who are vulnerable, those who are overlooked by society. We need to be more proactive in protecting those at risk.
And we need to support law enforcement and forensic science. Give them the resources they need to solve these crimes and bring these perpetrators to justice.
But most importantly, we need to remember the victims. We need to honor their lives, learn from their stories, and work to create a society where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
Well said. This has been a really heavy journey exploring the darkest parts of humanity, but hopefully it's a journey that can lead to greater understanding and a commitment to building a better world.
I agree.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer.
Thank you.